Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be continuing with the 3 months of modal logics, a sequel to 100 Days of Logic here with Carneades.org, looking at the final 10 days of logic. Today we are going to be looking at solving the paradox of dogmatism with temporal and epistemic logic. So in the last couple of videos, we've been looking at how we can pair all of the different kinds of modal logics we've learned about together. In this video, we're going to be looking at pairing temporal and epistemic logic. Now, this is going to get a little bit more technical than the previous videos. So if you have trouble with it, I apologize. I'm going to try to make it as simple as I can and try to use as many examples as I can. If you are struggling, go back and watch the videos on temporal logic and epistemic logic, especially justification logic, to get a little bit of a sense of it. But with that, let's get started. So, the paradox of dogmatism. If you don't know what that is, check out my video on it. We'll talk about it a little bit here, but that video kind of explains it in full. So, the paradox of dogmatism is very clearly a problem for epistemic and temporal logic. Basically, it states that once we know something, even if we are presented with contradictory evidence, we must not change our minds, or we wouldn't be justified in changing our minds, or at the very least, we are justified in not changing our minds. It is a question of belief change and justification change over time. The exact kind of thing that we need epistemic and temporal logic to deal with. Before we get to the paradox, though, there are a few preliminaries to discuss. First, what do you think of this claim? Take a look at it, see if you can translate it on your own. We're going to have a lot of moments like that in this video where I'm going to challenge you to translate something on your own or figure it out on your own, because the best way for you to learn is not just to listen to me, but to try to do some of these things yourself. All right? I would translate that as a subject S knows that P implies that S will always know that P. Now, in order to assess this, we're going to need to break down knowledge into its constituent parts. We're not going to be talking about the Gettier problem, Gettier defeaters here, and we're not going to be talking about warrant or other externalist concerns. We're going to be going with this simple definition of knowledge because everything else is going to be complicated enough, and we didn't talk about externalist logic or ways that logic can help solve the Gettier problem. So, knowledge generally has 3 parts: truth, belief, and justification. Now, we will see whether or not these can stand the test of time. If you know something now, will you always know that thing? First, if something is true now, will it be true later? Well, this seems to be clearly false. It seems that it can be true that it is raining now, but not true later. But this is not actually what we are claiming when we say that if you know something now, you would always know it. If you know that it is raining, well, it may not be the case that it will always be raining. It might be the case that it is always the case that it was raining at some point in time. Note the difference here. We're not saying that it is always raining as soon as it starts raining. We're saying that at every point after the point that it is raining, it, at some point in the past from that future point, was the case that it was raining. This can be symbolized as P implies G, PP. Or, if something is the case now, it will always be the case that it at some point in the past was the case. And it's already an axiom of our system. It's axiom GP. Basically, if some proposition is true, then it will always have been true at that time. This is all we need for knowledge of that proposition. However, the following claim does not seem to represent what we're saying. If you know that P at a certain point in time, then it will always be the case that you knew that P. If S knows that P, then it will always be the case that S knew that P. We don't want to say simply that if you know that P now, you will always have known that P. But rather we want to say, if you know that P now, you will always know that P was true then. The key difference is when our knowledge claim is taking place. We're not saying 3 years in the future it will be the case that right now you knew that P was true, but rather that in 3 years you will at that point know that P was true at some point in the past. Or in other words, we don't want to say if at 2 p.m. Hamid knows that it is cloudy, then it will always be the case that at 2 p.m. Hamid knew it was cloudy, but rather if at 2 p.m. Hamid knows that it is cloudy, then it will always be the case that Hamid knows at that some future point that at 2 p.m. in the past it was cloudy, and that is not what this expression says. This formulation would seem to be more representative of our claim. Take a look at it once again, see if you can translate it on your own, see how you would translate or express it on your own, and see if you think that it would be more representative of the claim we're trying to make here. If S knows that P, then it will always be the case that S knows that P was true in the past. While the former statement did simply follow from the axiom GP, this statement seems to be debatable. If Wally knows that it is 40 degrees outside at 3 p.m., will it always be the case that he still knows that it was 40 degrees at 3 p.m.? It seems to be at least up for debate, though we're going to look at some of the other criterions for knowledge and see where that is problematic. So let's take a look. Next, let's concern ourselves with belief. Look at the following 3 expressions. First, how would you translate them? Second, which expression are we looking for when we are asking if once you know something, you will always know it? I don't want to even read them right now because I don't want to spoil your ability to try to translate them on your own. We have GP outside the brackets of belief, inside the brackets of belief, and split on either side of the brackets of belief. Okay? Look at those. Try to translate them on your own. Once you're done with that, follow me and let's keep going. So, the first expression seems to be simply a consequence of our axiom above. It could be translated as if S believes that P, then it will always have been the case that S believed that P at some point in the past. Or in other words, if Raphael believes that he is 10 years old in 1990, then it will always be the case that Raphael believed that he was 10 years old in 1990. While this follows from the system, it does not seem to be asking the more interesting question of once you believe something, will you always believe it? Take a look at the second proposition now. This, on the other hand, seems to basically test whether or not S believes that basic axiom that P implies GPP. It can be translated if S believes that P, then S believes that it will always be the case that P was true at some point in the past. Or in other words, if on Sunday, Kumba believes that she is at the market, then on that same Sunday, in conjunction with that same belief, Kumba also must have the belief that it will always be the case that she was at the market on Sunday. Note that we're talking at 2 beliefs that are happening at the same time when Kumba is at the market on Sunday. And her then beliefs about whether or not it will be the case that she was at the market on Sunday at all points in the future. This seems quite intuitive, though it might require some amount of logical omniscience. Check out my videos on logical omniscience in the epistemic logic part of this series for more information. But either way, it's not the proposition that we are looking for. We're not looking to debate the idea of logical omniscience. We're looking to debate the idea of belief change over time. Now take a look at this proposition. The third expression seems to be more along the lines of what we are looking for. We could translate it as, if S believes that P, then it will always be the case that S believes that P was true at some point in the past. If on Friday Tatiana believes that she finished her homework, then it will always be the case that Tatiana believes at that point in the future that she finished her homework on Friday. This seems to be the question we are asking. And furthermore, it seems that we should answer in the negative to this question, that this is a false statement. People often change their minds. One could believe today the earth is flat, but learn tomorrow that the earth is round. Tatiana could come to believe that she actually has more homework to do. It seems that people can change their minds. Just because they believe something at one point in the past doesn't mean that they will always believe that thing. This is importantly going to spoil our knowledge claim, since belief is a necessary part of knowledge. So this will show that if you know something right now, it's not necessarily going to be the case that you will always know that thing, because at some point in the future, you could come to no longer believe it. However, irrationally changing your mind is not really what the paradox is concerned with. It seems that people can change their minds without logical reason all of the time. The more interesting question has to do with the third part of knowledge. Can someone be justified in changing their mind once they have knowledge? So we're not saying, can it be the case that you, as a matter of fact, change your mind? But rather, can you be justified in doing so? Here's the more interesting question. So, before we answer this question, I want you to consider how you would codify the following statements. Once again, it's kind of a mini quiz in the middle of the video, just to test your own abilities for yourself of how well you're understanding these different kinds of logic and the way that they interact. This one's going to be a little bit tougher. Knowing that P justifies the claim that P will always be true. That's statement one. It will always be the case that knowing that P at a particular time justifies P at that time. Statement 2. Knowing that P justifies the claim that it will always be the case that P was true at some point in the past. Statement 3. And statement 4, it will always be the case that knowing that P at a particular time justifies belief in the claim that P was true in the past. Statement 4, and statement 5, knowing that P now justifies the belief that P was true for all future instants. So that P was true now for all future instants. All right? Hopefully those 5 statements make sense, and you can try, I highly encourage you to try on your own to codify them. Now, if you've already tried to codify them, or you've given up and want the answers of how I would codify them, let's take a look. So, the first one, knowing that P justifies the claim that P will always be true. I would classify this as KSP within those brackets of justification justifies GP. Or basically, Jacob, knowing that he is poor, justifies his belief that he will always be poor. This seems too strong, because while P may be true now, it's not necessarily always going to be true. So this really isn't what we're looking for. Jacob could win the lottery tomorrow. It will always be the case that knowing that P at a particular time justifies P at that time. We're going to codify that as this statement. At any point in the future, if Pinda knows at that point that she is pregnant, then she is pregnant at that point. This, on the other hand, seems too weak. It follows really directly from our definition of knowledge. If you know something, you have to be justified in that thing. So it doesn't matter at what point in the future you know that thing. That knowledge inherently justifies that belief. Now, we can get into the question of whether you can know that you know something, but the actual knowledge of that thing seems to justify the truth of that thing, because justification and truth are implicit parts of knowledge. The point here is this isn't what we're looking for. We don't just want to say that knowing P at some time justifies P at that time, but rather that knowing that P now justifies having been true now for all future times. that if you know that P right now, then at any point in the future, you're going to be justified in believing that P was true now. I apologize if my tenses are getting mixed up. Temporal logic is difficult to describe sometimes. So, next up, knowing that P justifies the claim that it will always be the case that P was true at some point in the past. I'd codify this as follows. So basically, Sonia knowing that she is mowing the lawn at 6 p.m. justifies the belief that it will always be the case that she was mowing the lawn at 6 p.m. Once again, this seems true, but too weak, and it's going to follow from our definition of knowledge and our axiom GP. This is similar to our example where Kumba was at the market, basically. So just because Sonia knows that she is mowing the lawn at 6 p.m., and therefore has a justified belief that it will always be the case that she was mowing the lawn at 6 p.m., it doesn't say anything about her future beliefs about this past event. Rather, it says something about her present beliefs about the actual state of the future in relation to the past. Hopefully that makes sense. It will always be the case that knowing that P at a particular time justifies belief in the claim that P was true in the past. We're going to codify it as this. It will always be the case that Vladimir, knowing he ate sausage for breakfast on a given day, will justify his believing that he ate sausage at some point in the past. This is closer to what we're looking for, but not quite. Because this could be the first time that Vladimir ever ate sausage. And so his knowing that he's eating sausage right now or right at some point in the future doesn't necessarily justify that he ate sausage at some previous point. It has a similar problem to our second iteration that we looked at. It's claiming that it will always be the case that if I know P at some point in the future, then I'm justified in the future in believing that P was true at some point in the past, which, as we stated, might not be the case because this might be the first time you're eating sausage. This is a reversal, really, of what we want to say. We actually want to say, if I knew P at some point in the past, then I will be justified in believing that P was true at that point in the past at some point in the future. Once again, hopefully that makes sense. Finally, we're going to move on to knowing that P now justifies the belief that P was true for all future instants. Now, it's highlighted in red because it seems to me that this is what we're looking for as far as a translation of this idea of if I know that P, I will be justified in believing that P for all points in the future. And here is how I would translate it. Let's break this down. So it will always be the case that it having been the case that at some point in the past Shu Ling knew she ran a mile justifies the belief right now that at some point in the past she ran a mile. So let's think about this. So for all points in the future, the claim that, or the fact of the matter that at some point in the past from that point in the future, you knew some P was true, then you are thereby justified in believing that at some point in the past that P was true. This seems to be what we're looking for. Basically, for all points in the future, if at that point, from some point in the past, you knew at that point in the past P was true, then you're justified in, at that point in the future, believing that at some point in the past P was true. It might seem like a strange translation, but it's going to map on correctly. It is saying that it will always be the case that if subject S knew that P at some point in the past, then subject S is justified now, or at some point in the future as the case may be, in believing that P was true at that point in the past, or at some point in the past. Hopefully that makes sense. Draw it out on a timeline if it doesn't make sense to you. It seems to me that that's going to be the correct translation. If you don't think that any of my translations in this video are correct, or if you have different translations that you think map on better, please leave them in the comments as always so that we can all kind of learn from them and go forward understanding these ideas. All right. With all of those translations and all of those ideas out of the way, let's take a look at the argument. So, if I know some statement P to be true, then I know that any evidence against P is misleading. I'm justified in disregarding evidence that I know to be misleading. If P is known, then I'm justified in disregarding all evidence against P. Therefore, once I know P, I will always be justified in believing that P. With premise 1, if I know some statement P to be true, then I know that any evidence against P is misleading. We can represent this as follows, or in other words, for all subjects S, propositions P, and reasons R, if S knows that P, then if R justifies not P, then R is misleading, or even S knows that R is misleading. It seems intuitively convincing that if you know something, then anything that contradicts this knowledge must be misleading, and that you know that it's misleading. Whether or not it just is misleading or you know it's misleading might have some problems with logical omniscience, but for now, let's understand it as that. I'm justified in disregarding all evidence that I know to be misleading. Basically, if I know some evidence to be misleading, that means I'm justified in believing that that evidence is not the case. For all reasons R, if I know R is misleading, I'm justified in believing not R. If some evidence is misleading, it seems then that I'm justified in not believing it, for the very reason that it is misleading. And then, if P is known, then I am justified in disregarding all evidence against P. For all subjects S, all reasons R, and all propositions P, S knowing that P, and R justifying that not P, justifies not R. Remember that little dot in the middle conjoins those two pieces of justification to collectively justify not R. If I know P to be true, and R is evidence against P, then I am justified in not believing R. Hopefully all of that makes sense. Once again, if you're confused, check out the videos, especially in epistemic logic and in justification logic. Therefore, once I know P, I will always be justified in believing that P. This is the proposition we looked at earlier that we kind of overanalyzed. For all subjects S and all propositions P, it will always be the case that S knowing P at some point in the past justifies S believing that P was true at some point in the past for all points in the future. In other words, once I know P, I will always be justified in believing that P was true at that point in the past. Hopefully this makes sense, and hopefully from earlier in the video you got a good sense of why this might be intuitive. However, though it may be intuitive in the abstract, it's actually going to be quite concerning. To make sense of this, let's take an example. Say at 8 a.m., Sekou knows that he put his gym clothes in his bag. He knows this because he believes he put them there. He has some justification for believing this claim. He remembers putting them there, and it's in fact true. He did in fact put his gym clothes in his bag. Now imagine that upon getting to the gym at 8:30, Sekou looks in his bag and sees no gym clothes. He also sees no holes in the bag, and it doesn't appear that the bag was open. My intuition is that Sekou is no longer justified in his belief that he put his gym clothes in his bag, even though he knew it at the time. If this still doesn't give rise to your intuition, say that he goes home and finds his gym clothes nicely folded on his bed. He asks his wife, and his wife says, "Oh no, you didn't put your gym clothes in your bag." He checks the surveillance tapes in his house and sees a tape of him not putting his gym clothes in the bag. It seems that even though he did in fact put his gym clothes in the bag, and all of those other pieces of justification are in fact misleading, perhaps because his wife is trying to make him think he's going crazy, he seems to, with just those pieces of justification in front of him, be not justified in believing that he put his gym clothes in his bag. However, it seems to me that we can actually solve this paradox, at least to a certain degree, and definitely for the skeptic, by making a distinction between different levels of justification. There's a difference between being justified, one, this is the first version of justified we're going to use, given all of the relevant evidence that will ever come up. So in the case of Sekou, it would be both all of the evidence that he doesn't have his clothes when he's at the gym, the bag doesn't appear to be open, the tapes are there, his wife has told him this, but also the evidence that his wife actually was the one that took the gym clothes out of the bag, was the one that changed the surveillance tapes and is lying to him. He has all the relevant evidence to him. So once he has all that relevant evidence, he can be justified in having a belief. And being justified too, which is given merely the evidence that you have access to. It seems that if you're justified too, then your knowledge does not imply future justification. But if you're justified one, of course your knowledge does imply future justification, because you already have access to all of the relevant pieces of information. It seems that for us to conclude that your knowing some P will always justify your knowledge that P, we must base our knowledge on justification 1. If we base it on justification 2, then we may not be justified, either 1 or 2, at some point in the future. Okay? Hopefully that makes sense. Either you have a higher standard for justification, or you have a lower standard for justification. The paradox arises when you just have that lower standard, but if you have the higher standard, the paradox is not going to arise. As the title of the paradox states, it is a paradox for the dogmatists, but not in the way it's originally meant. The paradox is for anyone that accepts insufficient justification for their claims, namely justification 2. If you simply wait for sufficient justification for your claims, justification 1, as the skeptic does, no paradox is going to arise, because as soon as you know something, you already have all of the relevant information, and so there will be no more information that can be added, which would cause you to be justified in changing your belief. The message of this paradox, to my eyes, is that you will inevitably face contradictions if you claim you have knowledge on insufficient justification, which does not take into account the possibility that justification may be undermined over time. Next up, we're going to be looking at modal logic and God, combining deontic, temporal, and epistemic logic with alethic modal logic in classic arguments for the existence of God. We're just going to be looking at some of the ways that we can represent some of these classic arguments for the existence of God using all of the different kinds of modal logics we've learned about. Watch this video and more here at Carneades.org, and stay skeptical, everybody.